Michael Miller is the author of The Ultimate Guide to Bitcoin. Michael, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Hi, Jeff. Good to be here with you.
This is the first episode in a week of Bitcoin interviews, and you're a perfect guest because many of the people listening are software engineers who understand things like public key cryptography and hashing, but they may not be familiar with Bitcoin other than what they have heard in passing. And your book was written to explain the technology to anybody. To start off, what is Bitcoin?
Well, Bitcoin is, some people call it a cryptocurrency or a virtual currency. It is definitely not a traditional currency, but it's a way to exchange value, essentially digitally and virtually anonymously from one person to another person or from one organization to another organization.
And I want to emphasize to the listeners right now, if you're thinking, okay, Bitcoin is useful just because it allows me to electronically transfer funds like PayPal or Apple Pay, you're missing the point. The breakthrough functionality Bitcoin provides is decentralization. So what is decentralization and why is it useful?
Well, what this means, in traditional currencies such as the U.S. dollar or the euro or, take your pick, the currency is controlled by a central government or a central organization, a central bank. And they decide how much money is out there and how much money isn't out there and what happens to their money and to a certain degree decide how much their money's worth. And through that, we've got various official means of exchanging that data. I mean, we use credit card companies and we use PayPal to send money back and forth, and we just hand people dollar bills, too, from time to time. But with a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, there is no central governing organization. There is no apparatus. I mean, there is no one group of people that controls what happens with Bitcoin. There is no Bitcoin help desk. There is no Bitcoin tech support. There is no, none of this. It's all kind of out there in the cloud. And the advantage of that to some people, one is, well, you get away from that kind of control. You don't have the government control. So if you're big on not having government control, a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're not dealing with governments. It also has a huge amount of anonymity because we're not going through big companies and banks and credit card companies and the government keeping track of this, that we can exchange funds without anybody knowing it. And that has advantages for a lot of different things, both legal and illegal, for that matter. It also, because it is not tied to any national currency, it's a decent way for countries or people who have currency issues. I mean, if you've got some developing third world countries that really their own currency isn't worth a damn, but they can exchange money in Bitcoin and be tied into something larger and have that actually be more stable than what they're used to doing. So there are a lot of advantages to it. Now, there are disadvantages to it, too, because it isn't backed by anything, by any organization or government. It's kind of the wild, wild west out there in terms of Bitcoin. We don't have a national, Securities and Exchange Commission that's regulating this stuff, or an FDIC that's guaranteeing investments. I mean, you can lose your Bitcoin and you lose your Bitcoin. You deal with a Bitcoin exchange that goes under or gets hacked, and you're just out of luck. There's no backup to it whatsoever.
Could you define the term fiat currency?
Well, fiat currency, in traditional currencies, you really have two types, although today we really only have one type. In the old days, a currency was backed by a commodity. I mean, people might know the term the gold standard or remember the gold standard, where, the price of the dollar was essentially backed by the U.S. gold reserves or a country's gold reserves. Well, a fiat currency is still run by a larger entity like a government, but it is not backed by any commodity. So today, the U.S. government can print as much money as they want to. Essentially, that's within their purveyance because it's not tied to a commodity, but it is, backed up by the U.S. government. I mean, you're not going to say, "Oh, U.S. government, that's no good." No, it is backed by the government, just as the euro is backed by the European organization. it's not backed up by any, a block of gold over here or anything like it used to be in the old days. We went off the gold standard back in the 70s, I think, under Nixon. But
so the value of a fiat currency seems to be the fact that you have an institution that's providing support. It's like the value of your Windows operating system is the fact that Microsoft, will support it. Microsoft will continue to have updates to it, in some sense. So when you think about fiat currencies, like US dollars or pesos, what are some ways in which intermediaries can take advantage of their power over fiat currencies?
Well, if we look, let's say, at the U.S. system, the government can control, the rate of inflation per se by how much currency we have out there. If we've got a slowdown in the economy, they can just print more money, and it's backed up by them. It isn't backed up again by anything hard, in gold or diamonds or whatnot, but it is backed up by the United States government. The government says it's worth this much, and it's worth that much. Because of fiat currencies like that, obviously, then that money is exchanged by all sorts of entities and organizations, banks, the stock exchange, PayPal, credit card companies, they're all used to dealing with that money because it is backed up by the United States government. They know it's not going to go away tomorrow. Now, that might be different if you're in Greece. Greece has Greece is using the euro right now. But, if Greece, suddenly dropped the euro, which has always been a possibility recently, and they went back to the drachma or whatever their currency is, it may be backed by the Greek government, but it may not be worth anything also. So there's kind of a downside to fiat currency, but not with major, governmental powers.
So, but what about banks? How do banks exploit their role in the fiat currency system?
Well, they make money off of every transaction, for one. Every little thing you do at your bank or anybody does at a bank is charged. So, they might be making half a penny here, half a penny there, whatever, but it all adds up. They also get to store the money. When you deposit the money, it's setting in, they don't have dollar bills setting in their banks anymore, but the digital equivalent of that is setting in their digital equivalent of a vault, and they're earning money while they're storing your money. So, it's a matter of having a middleman there, and the middleman being able to make money just by handling things and handing things back and forth. And
also, they could borrow against it and do all sorts of things that could potentially endanger the money that you have in that institution, although it's FDIC insured or...
It's FDIC insured, and of course we still have the issue of too big to fail.
Sure.
So, so they can take our money and do anything they want with it and gamble it away, which essentially they've been doing over the past decades or so. And, because of the bank's size, because of those institutions' size, probably nothing's going to happen to them because it might be bad happening to us, mind you, but to the banks themselves, unfortunately, they're major powers. They're kind of protected just because of their size and their influence.
So now we've articulated why centralization is dangerous. You have to have money in these banks. These banks are inherently problematic. So, but now explain why we do need banks. So, and I think the most iconic way to explain this is the double spending problem. We have this thing called the double spending problem, where if this classic problem in cryptocurrencies in the past, where if you have a dollar in your cryptocurrency, you can essentially spend that dollar twice, right? You give it to Betsy and you give it to Alice, and you've made two transactions in the ledger to these two different people, but because you don't have a central institution to verify that these transactions are both valid, this is problematic. So we've got this thing called the double spending problem.
Yeah, because with virtual currency, it isn't backed by anything. It's not in a bank. It's not in some huge ledger. Now, again, this is before Bitcoin. So basically, it depends on your word, right? You say you have this virtual currency, so you're going, as you said, you're going to give some of it to Betsy and some of it to Bob over here. And there's nothing really to check on that. What Bitcoin did, and was one of several virtual. I mean, there are actually hundreds of cryptocurrencies out there now, all operating with similar technology. But Bitcoin was really the first to popularize it. Is to use something called a blockchain. And as you mentioned before, blockchain is really the key thing behind it, the real important thing behind Bitcoin. And what a blockchain does, it is essentially adds. It is a master ledger of every single Bitcoin transaction out there, period. And it is decentralized. It's out there in the cloud. It's on multiple computers, on multiple users' computers. A copy of the blockchain is. So you can't, if you go in and hack it on one computer, it still exists on 1,000 other computers. So that's kind of a safety thing there. It's almost unhackable because of the encryption it uses. But basically the way it works is when you make a Bitcoin transaction, if I pay you 1 Bitcoin for the services that you rendered to me, all right? That transaction gets entered into the blockchain. Essentially, it's a new block in a chain of blocks. And since that registers every single Bitcoin transaction, it's registered. You can't double spend something because it's there and it's out. While the participants are private, the transaction is public. So that transaction is out there. Everyone sees it. It's out there on multiple computers. You can't hack into it. If you try and duplicate that transaction or spend that Bitcoin again, you can't because it's just out there. And in this blockchain, I mean, if you envision it as a series of boxes, let's say, one connected to another, like in a PERT diagram or something, I mean, it's long. I mean, it's thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of transactions long and growing every day because every new transaction that's done is a new block added to the blockchain out there in the public. So you can't steal it. You can't double spend it. You can't do anything like that. It's just there.
Right, and so I want to get into more of the engineering stuff, but first I want to talk a little bit more about the higher level. So we've articulated why centralization is dangerous, we've articulated why we needed it in the past, and we've articulated why Bitcoin and the blockchain allows us to not need centralization anymore, at least in some contexts. Is there any usage for centralization post-Bitcoin, post-blockchain? Like, what is centralization still useful for beyond its classical now deprecated ideas?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's deprecated. I mean, there is value in a lot of different approaches, and certainly to the average consumer, there is value to centralization in that it lends support, security, insurance, even peace of mind, per se, if you want to think of it that way. Again, the problem with Bitcoin, I would not recommend that my aunt goes out and gets into Bitcoin, for example, because for a number of different reasons, but one of which is because it really isn't secure. It isn't backed by anything. When something goes wrong, it goes wrong. If someone steals your Bitcoin wallet or hacks into a Bitcoin exchange, you're just out. There is nothing backing it up, and I think that's an issue to function as a stable currency, which I don't think Bitcoin is doing today, for a number of reasons. But to function as a stable currency, I think it needs security in addition to stability, and stability is the other issue on it right now. Right now the price is up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down on Bitcoin, which is fine for a medium of speculation, but is not really, on currency you spend every day. You don't want it to be worth one thing today and something else completely different tomorrow. So, Bitcoin is still kind of, I look at it as almost a proof of concept. It's built on a technology. It's the first currency built on technology, which is fascinating. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to replace the dollar tomorrow.
What about government? Like, could we use the blockchain technology to replace a lot of the functionalities that we currently vote on? How could government change with blockchain technology?
Well, blockchain technology is a lot of different entities are looking at blockchain technology. I know that the art world is looking at it, for example, as a way to authenticate pieces of art and transactions there. So that you talk about your double spending thing. Well, talk about pieces of art where you've got forgeries going on out there and transactions that are off the books and that sort of thing. Well, if every transaction got put into a blockchain, you're not going to have to worry about forgeries and that sort of thing. You're going to know where the real transactions are. The world of music is looking into it as a means of compensating artists for their music being played. Right now you've got to, the music industry is a mess, has been a mess forever. It's more of a mess today than ever.
Because of the middlemen.
Yeah, because of the middlemen, exactly. And because, where does music get played? It gets played in a club here, and it gets played on the radio here, and it gets played on this internet station and the streaming service, and keeping track of it is horrible, and there's always somebody in the middle, getting their 50% also, and it's never a small percent. It's always about 50% in the music industry. Well, if all of these music transactions got entered into a blockchain, we can get payments directly to musicians without middlemen, and it's going to be tracked a whole lot better. I was reading an article today where NASDAQ is actually looking at incorporating the blockchain as a means of managing and verifying their transactions. So that technology can be used in a lot of different ways without being a standalone thing like Bitcoin. It's a very interesting concept, really, behind the whole thing on how we keep track of stuff. And it really is, in a way, kind of a crowdsourced thing, because it really does depend on the participation of a lot of different users and their computers to handle the encryption and to handle the storage and to decentralize the storage on it. So by decentralizing it that way, it almost makes it more secure.
So now that we have some context around the practical applications of Bitcoin, of the blockchain, let's talk about some of the engineering. And like we said, the real innovation is not Bitcoin, but rather the blockchain. Bitcoin is like email, and the blockchain is like the whole internet. And what I mean by that is Bitcoin is certainly cool. It's certainly an innovation, just like email. But you can, all you can do with email is just send like messages with text, which is great. But, with the internet, you can do all kinds of things. You can get on Facebook. You can use Google Docs. You can do VoIP. There's so much more functionality. And with the blockchain, the idea of decentralization is much more generalized. So now let's talk in a little more fine-grained engineering detail. What is the blockchain?
Well, like I said, it really is a general ledger of transactions. When you go to exchange a Bitcoin, buy a Bitcoin, sell a Bitcoin, pay someone, or whatnot, it involves public key encryption. So you send your public key to the other person sends his public key to you, and that message goes out to, for want of a better word, let's call it the Bitcoin network. All right. And this is just a series of computers owned by individuals that have agreed to participate in these transactions. And what happens is that transaction, which is encrypted, has to be verified. And to be verified, a computer has to run a series of mathematical calculations on it without getting too more technical than I even understand, let alone can explain. But it's real heavy-duty brute force computing sort of thing, where a very heavy-duty mining computer has to solve these calculations. And as a matter of fact, multiple computers will go in and essentially bid on these things and try and solve the calculations. The first computer that solves the calculation, two things happen. One, the transaction is verified and is added to the blockchain. Second, the computer that solved that calculation, that essentially verified that transaction, is awarded a certain number of bitcoins as compensation. It's called Bitcoin mining, and this is how, new bitcoins are created, and how people and individuals, organizations are incented to participate in the whole Bitcoin network and verify the transactions and that sort of thing. Once a transaction has been verified, it is added to the blockchain. That copy of the blockchain is then propagated across the entire network. So, at any given time, this computer, that computer, the other computer might have slightly different versions of the blockchain, depending on what new transactions have been appended or not. But, within a very short period of time, all those versions come into congruence. And we've got, the same version now propagated across the entire network. And because it is propagated on so many different computers, that's your security right there.
And so I think that was a great explanation. Just to put a finer point on that, could you give a definition of a distributed ledger?
Distributed ledger is essentially the blockchain, that ledger is distributed across the entire network.
Great. And more broadly, how does a peer-to-peer network function?
Well, peer-to-peer network, of which this is kind of a peer-to-peer network, and as we're used to in the old days with Napster and whatnot today, is essentially multiple computers connected together over the internet, of course, that share files or information of some sort without a central server. There is no central server in a peer-to-peer network. The interactions, the transactions, the transfers go directly from one computer to another, or in many cases from multiple computers to others.
And so let's say I'm a new user who is joining this peer-to-peer network, this Bitcoin network. How do I get started?
One, I'd recommend you probably don't. In terms of the support network, I mean, I'm not talking about doing Bitcoin transactions itself, but in terms of this Bitcoin network, let's just start the mining network. Let's say.
Sure. Before we get into the mining, let's just say if I want to get involved as a consumer, I want to have a Bitcoin wallet. I want to have some money. What does that mean? Like, how do I get a Bitcoin wallet, and how do I get some Bitcoins?
Well, there are numerous services out there. You can read my book and Google them, without pushing any of them. CoinDesk, there's a ton of them out there. Probably the easiest way is to find a Bitcoin exchange, of which there are dozens, if not hundreds of them out there in different countries. And we talk about Bitcoin not being centralized. Well, it kind of is with some of these Bitcoin exchanges because they try and facilitate the transactions. So the easiest way to go to it is to, go to a Bitcoin exchange, create an account, and buy some Bitcoins, which you can do with a credit card online. You can say, I want to buy one Bitcoin, and today a Bitcoin is worth $286 or whatever the price is at this hour. And you give them your money, they create a Bitcoin for you. Now, the confusing thing to the general public is that we're talking about Bitcoin, but there are no such things as Bitcoins. There's no physical coin. There's no paper money involved in Bitcoin. In fact, there's not even a digital file that you store on your computer that is a Bitcoin. Bitcoins essentially don't exist within the Bitcoin ecosystem. What exists are records of the transactions. And the records of those transactions are stored in digital wallets. So when you want to get involved with Bitcoin, you have to install a digital wallet, an open source piece of software on your computer or your smartphone or tablet or whatever. For that matter, if you go to some of the big Bitcoin exchanges, they will have cloud-based digital wallets for you. Okay? And this wallet, this piece of software, will store records, encrypted records, mind you, of all your Bitcoin transactions. So every time you make a transaction, you'll get a new address for that transaction. It will be stored in your digital wallet. Based on those transactions, the wallet calculates how many Bitcoins you have. But in and of itself, you're not storing a Bitcoin file. You're just storing a record of those transactions. So you get involved with this. You go to one of these Bitcoin exchanges. You either download a digital wallet software onto your computer, or you decide to use their cloud-based digital wallet. You get all the encryption keys that you need to access your wallet, and then you start buying, and for that matter, even selling, Bitcoin. And that's probably the easiest way for an individual to get into it. Now, obviously, you can also exchange Bitcoins from person to person without using an exchange, because an exchange will take a little bit off the top, but if it's you and me exchanging Bitcoin, we don't have to give anybody anything. But again, all the transactions still go out to the network to get verified and added to the blockchain, even if it's just us two individuals. But we would essentially send transaction records, from my wallet to your wallet, and we would exchange Bitcoin in that manner. And same thing if you're buying something. If you go to a site like Overstock.com or Tiger Software, whatever Tiger Software is called today, you would use essentially by sending funds from your Bitcoin wallet to the retailer's Bitcoin wallet.
And once I have my wallet, I can participate in transactions, like you said. So, for example, I can find somebody who has Bitcoins and needs some programming work done. So let's say, I want to get some Bitcoins. I start with 0 Bitcoins. I just have my wallet, and I just want to do some programming work, and I want to get paid in Bitcoins. So I'm going to go and do the work, and then they're going to pay me in Bitcoin. And now I've participated in the Bitcoin economy just as a simple consumer or, well, a worker, however you want to describe it. But what if I now find out that I was doing programming work for some malicious site, some like a porn site or something? I don't want this on my record. But the thing is, my transaction, isn't it going to be broadcast to the entire network? And everybody is going to know that I've contributed code to like, a porn site or something malicious. How private are my Bitcoin transactions if I'm broadcasting them to the entire community?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that's difficult to explain and to grasp. But essentially, while the transaction is public, that is, this wallet sent 2 Bitcoins to that wallet, the identity of the wallets are private. So that we know that this transaction took place, we don't know who it was. And that's the privacy part. And you can't trace it back because we're all talking about very strong encryption here. That the transaction exists, but we really don't know who did the transaction. That's a plus and a minus. It's a plus for anonymity, right? Nobody knows that you work for a porn site or that they paid you and overpaid you or underpaid you, as the case may be. But also, it also means because it's totally anonymous, if you lose your wallet, you can't just go up to the blockchain and say, hey, that was my transaction, so give me my money. It's lost, so you don't, because of the anonymity, you are also kind of at risk because there's no backup there, but it is anonymous. So if you're doing, stuff you don't want people to know about, and be quite honest, some subset of the Bitcoin economy is in illegal activities. It's a great, if you want to buy illegal drugs or pay for a hit on your ex-wife or whatnot, this is a pretty anonymous way to pay for it. But I'm not saying that's the majority of Bitcoin. It's not, but it is, part of the. Put it another way, Bitcoin is a majority of the payment structure of illegal activities, but not necessarily the other way. Okay. And it's understandable why, because it is anonymous. You can make these transactions, and again, the transactions are public, but who's doing the transactions and for what and why and where, totally private.
Right. Okay, so now let's say I want to actually mine some Bitcoins. I've got my wallet, and I as a caution to any listeners, obviously, you probably don't want to get involved in mining, and we'll get into why you don't want to, but what else, hypothetically, if I wanted to get involved in mining, what else do I need to get started?
Well, to get involved in mining, you need a computer that can do these kind of brute force, high-speed calculations. And you say, oh, I got a computer just sitting over here in the corner. Let's just use that computer. You could. Okay, the problem is you're competing against people and organizations who have much, much more powerful computers. Because, let's say that, I forget what the current rate of Bitcoin mining is today, but, let's say that you earn... I think it's
25?
Yeah, 25 I think 20 to 24, 25, somewhere in there. So you earn 25 Bitcoin. Well, at $280, do the math here, that's $7,500 or so, is that right? That you would earn. That's not small change. I'd like to earn $7,500 today just by having my spare computer do some transactions for me. The problem is lots of other people would too. So you're competing with organizations, entities, some individuals who have invested a lot of money in some very powerful computers. There are companies out there that sell mining computers. These computers cost $10,000 or more. They're not, what you buy at Best Buy, right? They're even more powerful than the typical gaming computer. In fact, the best ones are purpose-built for this purpose. And you consume a lot of energy, they consume a lot of processing time to get this done. So there's a huge, if you're going to compete in Bitcoin mining, there's a huge investment involved. And you're probably not going to do it with just one computer. The biggest Bitcoin miners have, factories or warehouses full of these computers. And what we've discovered is that it isn't actually the cost of the computer that's the biggest expense. It's the cost of the energy running the computers. At some point, you start paying, depending on the price of Bitcoin on any given day, you could actually expend more in energy costs and electrical costs than you earn back in Bitcoin mining. So what we find is a lot of the Bitcoin mining organizations have their facilities where energy is cheap. where they're able to use hydroelectric energy, or in countries or areas where the electricity costs are a lot cheaper than they would be, let's say, in downtown Manhattan. So the Bitcoin mining, while it can be profitable, and there are individuals and companies that have made a lot of money from mining Bitcoins, essentially, hashing through all these transactions, the investment and the continuing expense of powering these computers makes it something for only the big boys to play in. Okay,
so let's say I've bought my supercomputer, I've moved to China, I'm living on the edge of a hydroelectric dam, so my power is cheap. What else do I need? Do I need? So I've got my setup. I set up in my warehouse or whatever. Do I need to go and download like the entire past history of the blockchain? Do I just like plug into it somehow? What is the setup? What are the minutiae that I need to know?
Well, I mean, there is particular software you need to use, which is not much. It's open source stuff. CG Miner, Easy Miner, blah blah blah. I mean, it's open source software you can download. You've got to have your own Bitcoin wallet, of course, so you can exchange the Bitcoins back and forth. But that's basically it. I mean, yes, involved in the process, you're going to have to be downloading the blockchain as well, and that might take a little bit of time initially, but you've got the computing power there, so that's not a big deal.
I mean, how big is the blockchain? Do you have any idea?
Well, I don't have the answer to that. But,
okay.
I mean, but obviously it is growing with every single transaction, so it is a little bit of a deal. It's not, it is something that we could do if we wanted to download the blockchain chain and have it on our computers, but you probably wouldn't want to.
How is it not getting to the size where this is just like intractable to constantly verify this gigantic chain of transactions? Doesn't it just get so big that we can't, we don't have the time to perform all the work, or is it just?
Well, it's still manageable, although there is a theoretical limit on this. That in terms of, it's interesting in the mining of Bitcoins that, and this is kind of laid out in the, I don't know whether we want to call them guidelines or whatnot behind Bitcoin, but the basis behind the whole concept is that at the very early stages, where they're really trying just to attract anybody to get involved, you earned more Bitcoin for each mining transaction. So it started. I've got a chart somewhere in my book. I can't find it right now. Where it started out, but it started out you earned a high number of Bitcoins. And after X number of transactions, after X number of Bitcoins have been earned, that rate goes down, the payment rate goes down. And after X more transactions, the rate goes down again. So over time, if they're earning 25 Bitcoin today per transaction, that's going to go down to 1 at some point in time in the future. The other thing that happens is there's a theoretical limit on the number of Bitcoins. So when we reach this limit, which is not going to happen for dozens of years based on projections, then that's
like
all the
a
Bitcoin
century,
there.
right?
Right. That's probably closer to it. Then that'll be it. That'll be all the Bitcoin there are.
And then after that, why would people still be incentivized to do this mining? Because you have the incentivization for doing mining is, you're verifying transactions. You're spending all this compute resource to verify transactions, and you get paid to verify the transactions. So once all the Bitcoins have been mined, why would people still be incentivized to verify transactions?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure there's an answer to that, other than a century from now we'll probably be using something else. And who knows what technology we'll be using behind it, right? It'll be some holographic thing out there. And that's a fair question.
Yeah, this is going to be like the Y2K bug.
Yeah. I think the general nature of why the payment rate declines is the expectation is that the value of Bitcoin increases, right? Which it has and it hasn't over time. I mean, if you got into Bitcoin 2-3 years ago, at the beginning, 3-4 years ago, Bitcoins were worth a couple pennies. And over time, that has increased. Today we're at 280 some bucks in terms of the value of Bitcoin. So if you bought in, we're doing Bitcoin mining at the very beginning, and you mined 1,000 Bitcoins, well, you're sitting on some money right now, right? Something was worth pennies back then is worth $280 today, which now gets into the speculative nature of the currency, which is how a lot of people view Bitcoin today. not so much as a viable currency, although we've talked about various ways that it can be, and there are other ways that it can be. But most of the transaction volume today in Bitcoin is speculative. People are buying it saying it's going to go up, or they're shorting it saying it's going to go down, because it has. I mean, at one point, within the past year and a half or so, Bitcoin rose over $1,000 per Bitcoin in terms of value. And, certainly if you got into it pennies on the dollar and it's now at $1,000, wow, what a deal. Well, now it's gone down. Now we're at 200. I mean, it actually dropped well below 200 earlier this year. And now it's come up a little bit. I mean, it's very, very volatile, which makes it very difficult to use as an everyday currency. But, if you're speculating on it, as you would with hog bellies and pork futures and gold and diamonds, is interesting in terms of a speculative currency. And that is what a majority of the transactions are today, is pure speculation. People are gambling on it.
Although, what's too bad is that the speculation sometimes distracts, and this is why I spent so long at the beginning emphasizing, the practical application, because the speculation tends to distract, the mainstream media and lots of people who just see big numbers and they're like, oh, it's money, blah, 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 money's, we gotta speculate, blah, blah, blah. And, in fact, my little brother was mining cryptocurrencies a few years ago, and I would rebuke him for it because I was like, this is some kind of scam, you're panning for gold, and many people just really have trouble understanding why Bitcoin is more than an item of speculation. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the nature of this is that people don't understand why their paper money is worth anything. People don't really think about money. It's become this background axiom of how the world works. But it's worth talking about the speculation a little more, and like how big things could get. Like, you think about like how rich people have gotten off of the internet. Like, it's Bill Gates, for example, right, essentially got rich off of the internet and made previously unfounded sums of money, and it makes you think, like, are the wealthy of the future, if Bitcoin is as big as some of its proponents say it is, like, say it's literally like on scale with how important the internet was, are we going to have like a new order of magnitude of wealth in the world?
That is an interesting question. And you're right, the whole speculative nature of this really does blind us to the importance of Bitcoin. I mean, the importance is not that I can make $1 billion on it, or that somebody will, or somebody has, or somebody's lost $1 billion also. I mean, somebody makes it, somebody else loses it. The importance is the technology behind it and how it can decentralize our transactions and our currency transactions. But, you get into human nature, and people just like to make a quick buck. They want something for nothing. And the whole concept, I can just let my computer run in the background and I can make money from that. Well, that's appealing to some people. Somebody says, wait, if I buy something for $200 today and it's going to be worth $1,000 next month or 6 months from now, well, that's appealing too. I mean, we like to gamble. We like quick money. And what has happened, certainly over the past year, probably more within the past 6 months, is that we have got the professional financial speculators involved in Bitcoin. I mean, before a year or so ago, it was a very small community of traders. It was the Bitcoin congregation. It was an interesting combination of people. You had the technology people, the cryptologists who really founded this. I mean, this is a cryptography thing more than anything else. So you have people who are just theoretically into cryptography who found it fascinating and got into it. You had, the guys who were doing it because it was totally anonymous and they could finance their illegal activities. You had those guys. You have libertarians, financial libertarians, who don't want government control and government centralization, that this is an ideal currency for them to be involved with, at least theoretically, if not practically. So you had this interesting consortium of people coming from a lot of different angles into it. But what you didn't have was the professional financial people. Okay, I mean, it was techno geeks and cryptographers and libertarians, but where was Wall Street? Well, within the past year, certainly within the past 6 months or so, we've had more and more professional financial people get involved with this as a speculative nature, saying, hey, if we can invest in this, if we can, we think it's going to go down, we'll short it. We're betting on where Bitcoin is going to go. So now we've had the professional financial guys into it. So if you look at the Bitcoin sites today versus looking at them a year ago, they're emphasizing totally different things. A year ago, they were talking about the technology. They were talking about, how can we improve the cryptography and that sort of thing. Now it's just, well, where's the price going to go? And they're applying financial models. And I love watching these financial, I apply this model to it, and the price is going to be exactly 287.3 in exactly, 7 days. And because it follows this model, and that's a world I'm not familiar with and don't want to get familiar with, but they're into it now. And it's almost like that's where the Bitcoin train is going today. Now, whether they will get tired of that or not is the question, and whether it can settle back down and we can start talking about it as a viable currency again. A year ago we were talking about, well, what merchants are going to sign up to accept Bitcoin? Today it's, what financial traders are dealing with it. The world has totally shifted, certainly within the past 6 months, on Bitcoin.
Although, again, what's ironic is certainly they have this focus on Bitcoin and thinking of it in terms of a speculative currency or just a way to centralize wealth into their own hands. But the real innovation of it is that it decentralizes things. And something we haven't talked about much is that with the decentralized nature, you can do micropayments, and it allows, if I want to pay somebody in Bangladesh, like half a penny to do something, that becomes like a feasible idea. I don't know if half a penny is a reasonable amount, but 1 penny, right? In the past you can't pay somebody a penny to do something because it doesn't, halfway across the world. How am I going to send somebody halfway across the world a penny? It costs them more than a penny to send them that penny. So what's interesting is it adds a finer degree of granularity to the global economy, which is it's fundamentally game changing. And if you just think about that, that's why this is so important. That's one of the reasons why this is so important. The fact that you can do that micro value transfer means that we can, if I have a penny lying around, it doesn't make sense for me to have that penny because I can't do anything with it. But somebody in Bangladesh could do something with a penny. So anyway, that's more macro stuff. I do want to talk a little bit more about the engineering side of things. Could you describe what a mining pool is?
A mining pool is a collection of miners. We talk about the huge investment and the ongoing expense of doing Bitcoin mining because of the cost of the computers. Well, one way to do that is simply to spend the money, right? Yeah, people or organizations have the money to do that investment. The other way to get around it is to have multiple individuals gathered together into a pool to do the mining. And there are dozens of mining pools out there that you can join so that you can apply your whatever amount of computing power you have to the pool. The pool works together essentially to solve the equations and the calculations, and hopefully earn the bitcoins from the mining there. Even in a mining pool though, size matters. That even within a mining pool, you're competing with other miners within that pool. So if you think you can just get into it with a 10-year-old laptop or something, that's probably not going to work because you're not going to be participating much compared to somebody who's bringing a little bit more power to the pool. Pools work, and now there's dozens of different ways in which they distribute the funds, a kind of a first in, first out, who solved it first, who solved it last. Some of them distribute it more equally. You can certainly do it. Again, you Google mining pools, you can find them, and I talk about them a lot in the book also in terms of best approaches to it. But it is a way that, again, we're talking about power users here. We're not talking about your Aunt Nellie with an old laptop. But, there are ways for individuals to get involved in the Bitcoin mining via the mining pool. Be quite honest, though, you're not going to get rich at that because, again, you're still competing with the big boys. And I'm not sure how viable mining pools are going to be over the long term because of that. I mean, honestly, the companies that are investing in Bitcoin mining are spending some very, very big bucks, and getting a group of individuals together to compete against them might sound good on paper. I'm not sure how long-term viable that is.
So there is a possibility, when Bitcoin mining is happening all around the world, there is the possibility that two different legitimate histories can develop. And I've heard an analogy, and this is called a Bitcoin fork, I think. So I've heard an analogy between Bitcoin mining and like digging through layers of snow to get to the hardened earth below. And so the analogy is that like the top layers of the blockchain are mutable. You know, they're wet and slushy and they can shift around and they can change. But the ground beneath, as you go back in history along the blockchain, you get to firmer and firmer truth until it's until it's truth that the entire world has consensus around. And so, I mean, this is kind of like just how the history of the world works. You know, we've got a certain worldview of how history is. It's not, somewhat subjective, but over time we increasingly agree on what the past is and how we should frame the past. But could you explain this analogy a little bit more, and maybe you could define what a Bitcoin fork is?
Well, it has to do with things being done in multiple places in real time by different people or entities. In that, you know, let's say I'm working on this particular block over here. Somebody else is working on a different block over there.
That is verifying the transactions within the block.
Exactly. My block gets added to the version of the blockchain I have on my computer. That other person's block gets added to his version of the blockchain that he has on his computer. Now, we haven't talked to each other yet, right? I don't know about his work. He doesn't know about my work. We have essentially created two different versions of the blockchain, or what we call a blockchain fork. Now, my version of the blockchain starts getting propagated through the network. The other person's version of the blockchain with his block added starts getting propagated through the network. So at the very initial stages, we've got multiple versions of the blockchain out there. Now, the older parts of both blockchains are identical. They're identical. It's just this newer bit that's been added is what's different. And what has to happen over time, and it happens actually quite rapidly, is that the two versions get they get meshed together, and they get synchronized essentially, so that my block will be added to that version of the blockchain, and that person's block will be added to my versions of the blockchain, and we will have the same blockchain. Now, by the time that happens, somebody else has created a new block over here, and somebody else has created a new block over there. So again, we've got different versions of the blockchain on the tail end, right? The head end, the body is still the same. It's just the tail end is constantly being fiddled with. And that comes into synchronization over time as the different versions of the blockchain, you know, merge and get put together. It sounds like, oh man, it's a big problem, but it works itself out much faster than you would think. And it is, as I like the snow analogy, but you know, it is almost like having snakes with different tails out there that eventually the tails merge together. Right.
Definitely. And so we've discussed Bitcoin and blockchain internals somewhat. So let's zoom out and talk a little bit about the macroeconomics. If Bitcoin is so great, why are new cryptocurrencies being created?
Well, it's more of a technological reason than anything else, and that the cryptographers and the technical people behind it think they can do a better job. You know, everybody's trying to improve the technology. You know, it's not that Bitcoin is perfect. It isn't. It wasn't the first to go down this route, and it won't be the last to go down this route. It put everything together in the right way at the right time. Now, since then, we have other currencies out there that, and if you go to, you know, a lot of these Bitcoin exchanges, they're actually cryptocurrency exchanges, and they exchange more than just Bitcoin. But the thinking is, well, you know, Bitcoin did it this way, but it has these faults. So can we improve on that? So you have, I mean, literally, you know, over 100 different cryptocurrencies, all taking the same blockchain type based approach, but tweaking it here and there to try and, you know, if there's a little issue over here, well, can we fix that little issue, and can we do it without introducing new issues? And you know the way technology works, they're just trying to improve the technology. You know, that's why when people say, well, is Bitcoin going to be here, you know, 20 years from now? I don't know, probably not, but I'm sure cryptocurrency will be, and it'll be something that looks like Bitcoin but has just been improved because they've got a different cryptographic algorithm behind it, or they're approaching things just a little bit different or whatnot, trying to work the kinks out of it.
Right, and in some sense, like the US dollar that we have around today is nothing like the US dollar that we had 50 years ago. We could say, yeah, it's the US dollar still, but now it's all digital. Now we have derivatives. We have all kinds of new innovations that have been built sort of atop the US dollar. But we don't think of it as this updated, changed entity. So what else is going on in the blockchain space that we haven't talked about that is exciting to you?
Well, I think the progress on this front has slowed a little bit, but it is happening. Is the using it in terms of currency, that looking at trying to make it a little bit more mainstream. I mean, be honest. If you were dealing in Bitcoin a year ago, if you're dealing in Bitcoin today, it's a bit of a hassle. It's not as easy as putting in your PayPal address and or handing over your credit card. Okay, there's a lot more involved, which is why my Aunt Judy is never going to get involved with this at this point in time, and I'd never recommend that she did. I would get no end of phone calls. But the movement is to make it more user friendly and to make it more mainstream. So and to try and take some of the risk out of it by not having a centralized entity do the guarantees, but having individual entities have a little bit more in terms of guarantees. That is some of the newer exchanges, which they're not even calling themselves exchanges anymore, that try and have a little bit more guarantee in terms of what happens to your transactions and that sort of thing. And I think that makes sense. If it is to be a currency and not just a means of speculation, that it needs to be more user-friendly. It needs to have some guarantees behind it. I mean, it's not going to be like the government standing behind it, but at least if you've got a company standing behind your transactions, a big company, the founder of CNET's working on this. You got the Winklevoss twins working on it. You've got, we've got some big entities, not just guys in their basement anymore, but real, financial people getting involved with it. And that comes with pluses and minuses. But one of the pluses is it's trying to make it more user-friendly, easier for individuals to get involved with this. Obviously, some of the diehard people are opposed to this sort of thing. They think it's going the exact, especially the libertarian type people, is kind of going the exact opposite direction that they might have liked. But if you and I want to use Bitcoin to pay for our online transactions at wherever, it's got to be easy to use. It's got to be as easy to use as PayPal or a credit card. So I think there's that movement happening. I think it slowed somewhat of late as the prices fluctuated so much. I hate to always think of Bitcoin in terms of price, but that really is an important thing. I mean, we've had the price go from 0 to 1,000 and back down to 200, and I mean, you don't want to get involved with something that's that volatile.
It is a proxy for adoption.
Yeah. So, but if the price stabilizes, if it plays out in the $250 to $300 range and it kind of stays there, now the financial guys aren't going to like it because they don't have the big gains and the big losses to profit from. But the people who use it, it's more stable. I know that if I'm buying a big screen TV today, that's worth 1.5 Bitcoins. It's not worth 3 and it's not worth 0.5. I know that it's approximately 1.5 Bitcoins, and we can deal with it that way. And for it to be a viable currency, it has to stabilize. The speculation has to. There's always going to be they'll be speculating if it goes up $1. It doesn't have to go up $1,000 for speculation to exist. There will always be speculation, but it needs the volatility needs to decrease. It needs to stabilize more, and I don't know whether we're seeing that yet or not. Certainly for the past 4 or 5 months or so, it's been kind of in this $250 to $300 range, and that's a start. That'll get when it's stable. We will be less interested in speculation and more interested in making this work. Whether that's with the technology behind the scenes or the technology in the interface to get it to the end user. But, as we said all along, it's the technology that's important, not the price on this thing. So if the price has to stabilize, and then we can focus more on what's real behind the whole cryptocurrency thing.
So to begin to close off, part of the motivation within this podcast is to iron out some of the elitism that is in the world of software engineering, because most of the guests that I have on Software Engineering Daily are people who are very familiar with deeply technical topics, programming languages, distributed systems. These are people that have studied computer science, they've studied programming all their lives. But the thing is that the space of what we call software engineering is growing so much. And at the same time, the space of things that are not affected or are not in the scope of software engineering, that's kind of contracting. And so, part of the motivation for this podcast is to be accepting and to be inviting of people who are not traditional software engineer people into the fold of the world of software engineering and computer science, not only because they can and they should be here, but because we need them, essentially. So that's part of the motivation for bringing you on the podcast, and you've been so so great and so good, so explanatory at explaining the aspects of Bitcoin that are hard for even engineers to understand. But people like my parents, right, or my sister, they should be able to understand this stuff, because there's no opting out, right? There's no opting out in the future of technology. You can't just say, I'm going to go and do this career that doesn't involve technology, because those careers are all going away. And so, that's part of the motivation for this podcast. So to close off, I kind of want to get some idea. Do you have, since you're not like a programmer, but you were able to learn this stuff on your own. This is a brand new technology, and you're not like some young, spry 13-year-old with, just this, neuroplastic brain. How is it that you were able to learn this brand new topic and teach yourself everything you need to know about Bitcoin to write a book called The Ultimate Guide to Bitcoin?
Well, thank you for not referring to me as a 13-year-old spry, whatever. I actually have done some programming, but this will date me. I did programming in college using Fortran on punch cards. That dates me, unfortunately. And I've been D-based programming, whatever. So that way back in the past. No, I think the key thing with any technology, especially when you're talking about the people who create the technology, the people who listen to this podcast, is it's very easy to get caught up in the technical details. That's what you do every day, right? You're in there digging through the bits of code. You're making sure that this works with this and you don't get an error message. That's what you do every day. It is very easy to lose sight of what that technology is going to be used for and who's going to be using it. My background really is in marketing. I'm a writer, but I went to college and got a marketing degree. And one of the nice things about marketing, one of the focuses on marketing, is you always focus on the user or the customer. In fact, my mantra throughout all the years has always been, think like the customer. I really don't care that much about the nuts and bolts of the technology, because there are guys who do, who are listening to this podcast, and they'll work it out. You can work out just about anything, right? You got the smart guys in the right room. But what's important is you serve the needs of the user, of the customer, and you make the technology work towards those needs. So I'm always thinking about, I'm thinking about my Aunt Judy or my brother or the neighbor across the way or whatnot, and how they use the technology. And then we can backtrack. Then we can figure out how to build what it is for them. But you got to figure out what it is they want to do and what it is they need to do. And in the case of this cryptocurrency thing, you say, okay, well, how, my neighbor next door, how in the world does this affect them? And today, the answer is really not much, but it could for this reason and this reason and this reason. And then you start backtracking. So, well, what's important to that? And what builds that? And what feeds that? And just how much information do you really need to know to delve into this? And, today, because we are in the, if we were in the automobile industry, we're in the age where people are kind of bringing along a writing mechanic with them, right? That they've got the thing's going to break down somewhere between here and there. We're in the very, very early stages of this crypto technology, measured in years, not even in decades. So, and in the early stages of anything, you got to know a lot more about it, because you got to get your hands more dirty. Well, and because of that, my neighbor's probably not going to get involved with that, because they're busy cleaning their pool and cutting their grass right now, taking their kids to soccer lessons. But, 5 years from now, when this becomes a lot more common and becomes a lot easier to use, yes, then they probably will be involved in it. And they will need to know less about the technology at that point, because the technology will become more invisible. I don't know how my toaster works. Well, I do, but, you don't have to. All you need to know is put a piece of toast in it, and it works. Well, for technology to go out into the general populace. That's how it has to be. And yeah, everybody listen to this podcast, you're sitting there, you're taking the toaster apart and putting it back together and making it work better. And that's great, and we need that, but let's not lose sight in the whole process of who's using the toaster and what they're using the toaster for, and maybe they want a better piece of toast or whatever. But, always try to, step back a little bit from the nuts and bolts and say, okay, well, why? Who's using this? What do they want out of it? And, they really don't care whether, you use this programming language or that programming language or, what object library you use behind it. They, that becomes irrelevant. It's important to us who are building things, but not to the people who are using things. So, in terms of how I teach myself, I start with the end user and work backwards. And that's how I do any technology.
Awesome. Michael Miller, thanks so much for coming on to Software Engineering Daily. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
It's been nice being here with you too, Jeff.